Sophie Adams' life was turned upside down when she realized that the father of her troubled student Lucas was none other than her ex, Elliot Montgomery, now a billionaire. The man who had once promised her the world but left her broken. This isn't just a reunion, but a story of betrayal, lost love, and a shattered family. The question is simple. Can Sophie ever forgive him? Sophie Adams' life was simple, but it wasn't empty. As an English teacher at Woodbridge High, she found meaning in the everyday moments. A student's breakthrough, a quiet afternoon in her classroom, the satisfaction of watching young minds bloom. Her small apartment, tucked away on a quiet street, was a sanctuary of comfort and control. Books filled the shelves, pictures of her son, Daniel, were scattered on the walls, and the steady hum of her routine was a source of calm. Sophie had built this life from the ground up, brick by brick, after losing everything she once held dear. But it had always been this way. There had once been a time when her world wasn't quiet or controlled. It was full of love, laughter, and dreams. Elliot Montgomery had been her world, or at least that's how it had felt. Tall, handsome, full of ambition and charm, Elliot had swept Sophie off her feet when they were both young, just starting to carve their futures. They had plans, big plans. They would marry, build a life, a family, and together they would take on the world. But as the years passed, Sophie began to realize that Elliot's world was no longer the same as hers. His ambition grew. His eyes were always on the next big deal, the next opportunity. And with each passing day, Sophie felt further and further removed from him. The man she had once adored had become a stranger, consumed by success and power. Then came the day he left. No grand gesture, no closure, just silence. Sophie had thought for a long time that perhaps he would return, but the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into years. He was gone, and Sophie was left alone, a woman with a shattered heart and a future she could no longer share with the man she had once loved. She threw herself into her work, into raising Daniel, into a life that, though lonely at times, was hers to control. Sophie had moved on, or so she thought, but fate had other plans. The morning was like any other, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway blending with the chatter of students as they rushed to their classes. Sophie Adams was preparing for another long day of teaching, marking papers, giving her students advice, quietly watching as they navigated the ups and downs of high school life. She didn't expect much to be different today. After all, what could possibly disrupt the routine she had carefully constructed? That was until she saw the name on the parent-teacher meeting list. Elliot Montgomery. Sophie froze, her heart slamming against her chest. The room seemed to tilt around her, the words on the screen blurring as her mind raced. Elliot Montgomery. The name she hadn't heard in years. The name she had tried so hard to forget. But there it was, in black and white, the father of one of her students, Lucas Montgomery. Sophie's mind spun as 1,000 thoughts collided. Lucas, her troubled but brilliant student, the one she had taken under her wing for the past year. His father, the man who had once been her everything, was now the man she had to meet. Sophie had always known that Lucas's father was someone important, someone with power, but she had never thought to connect the dots. She hadn't imagined this, Elliot being the one to walk through those doors. A feeling of dread settled in the pit of her stomach as she forced herself to move. She couldn't stand there, frozen forever. She had a meeting to attend, a student to care for. But her hands were shaking as she walked to the conference room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes locked with him. There he was, Elliot Montgomery, Not the man she once knew, but something else entirely. Dressed in a crisp suit, radiating power and confidence, he was a far cry from the young man she had loved. Time had transformed him. He had become the billionaire she had heard whispers about. And in that moment, the world around Sophie seemed to collapse. The past she had buried came rushing back, flooding her chest with emotions she had long tried to suppress. And that's when everything began to change. Sophie stood there in the doorway of the conference room, her breath catching in her throat as she met Elliot's gaze. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the overwhelming rush of emotion that surged through her as soon as their eyes locked. It was like no time had passed at all, and yet everything between them had changed. He was different now, a stranger in an expensive suit, exuding the kind of self-assurance that only wealth could provide. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that used to hold so much promise, now felt distant and cold. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the weight of the years between them, the unspoken words that lingered like a cloud over their reunion. "Miss Adams," Elliot said, breaking the silence, his voice smooth but distant. "It's good to finally meet you in person. I've heard so much about you. How is Lucas?" Sophie blinked, trying to focus. She had to remind herself that this was a professional meeting. Lucas was her student, and this was about him, not the past. But the memories, the pain, it all came rushing back in that one brief moment. She managed a polite smile, but inside she was screaming. How could he ask about Lucas, the son they had both neglected, the son who was the result of their broken love? "Lucas is a bright student," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But he's struggling, Elliot. He's had some difficulties at home, and it's affecting his schoolwork." Elliot nodded, a slight frown tugging at his lips. "I'm aware," he said, his tone softening just a fraction. But there was something almost rehearsed about it, as though he was saying the right things, but not truly feeling them. "I've been trying to reach him, but it's been difficult. He doesn't want to talk to me." Sophie's heart ached for Lucas, but her anger towards Elliot flared up, unexpected and sharp. She couldn't hold it in anymore. Her voice wavered with frustration as she spoke. "Difficult? You abandoned him, Elliot. You abandoned us. And now you think showing up and offering your money, your business deals, is going to fix it?" The words came out before she could stop them, harsh and bitter. Elliot stiffened, his expression faltering for the briefest moment. But then, the mask returned. He wasn't going to apologize. Not here. Not now. Instead, he crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "Sophie, please," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But I was doing what I thought was best, for all of us. I thought that if I succeeded, if I built something real, then you and Lucas would have everything you could ever want." Sophie's breath hitched, her hands trembling. "And what about me, Elliot?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What about what I wanted? You didn't just leave me. You left us both. You didn't care about what I needed, what we needed. All you cared about was yourself, your career, your damn business." Her chest tightened, the pain of the years flooding back with every word. "You broke my heart. And you broke Lucas. Do you have any idea what it was like, raising him on my own? Do you have any idea what you took from us?" The room grew unbearably still as Sophie's words hung in the air. The silence was deafening, the rawness of the truth echoing between them. For a moment, Elliot didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on her, and Sophie could see the faint flicker of regret behind his polished exterior. But it was too late. The damage was done. Elliot shifted in his seat, and his jaw tightened as he exhaled sharply. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Sophie. I don't expect anything from you." His voice was low, almost defeated. "But I want to fix things with Lucas. I've made mistakes, but I want to make it right." Sophie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "It's not that simple, Elliot. You can't just waltz back into his life and act like nothing happened. You can't buy your way into his heart, just like you can't buy your way into mine." There was a long pause, the tension thick between them. For the first time, Sophie saw a crack in Elliot's armor. She saw the man he had become, broken, regretful, but still struggling to understand the consequences of his actions. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words soft but heavy with sincerity. But Sophie didn't know if she could believe him anymore. She turned away, wiping the tear that had slipped down her cheek. "Sorry doesn't change anything," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It's too late for that." The meeting ended in silence, both of them too exhausted to speak any further. As Sophie walked out of the room, her heart felt like it was shattering all over again. But the biggest revelation was still to come. The days following the meeting were a blur for Sophie. The school was busy with end-of-term preparations, but her mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Elliot. Despite her anger and hurt, she couldn't shake the image of him, the polished businessman, the man who had once promised her a future, now standing before her as a stranger. His presence lingered in her thoughts, and the weight of the words left unsaid seemed to press on her chest. She knew she had to focus on her students. She had Daniel to take care of, her own life to rebuild. But the past had a way of intruding, especially when it involved Elliot. Sophie tried to ignore the flutter of emotions whenever Lucas came into her class. The boy who reminded her so much of his father. He had Elliot's sharp eyes, his intense focus, but his heart seemed more closed off, more fragile. Sophie saw the boy behind the mask, the one who was struggling to connect with his father. It wasn't until one afternoon, when Sophie was reviewing some papers in her classroom, that the truth came crashing down in a way she wasn't prepared for. The knock on the door startled her, and she turned to see Lucas standing there, his face troubled, eyes filled with a storm of emotion. She had always known there was more to him than he let on, but today, the weight in his eyes seemed unbearable. "Miss Adams," he began, his voice shaking, "I need to talk to you." Sophie put down her papers and gestured for him to sit. She had always seen potential in Lucas, but today it was as if a dam had broken within him. He sat down, folding his hands in his lap, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "It's about my father," Lucas started, his voice faltering. "I don't know what to do." Sophie's heart clenched. She had always known Lucas was carrying something heavy, but hearing him speak about Elliot, his father, opened up something new. "What's going on, Lucas?" Sophie asked gently, leaning forward. "It's not just about me," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "It's about everything he's kept from me, about the life I never knew about." Sophie felt her stomach twist, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. This was more than she had bargained for. Lucas continued, his voice cracking. "I found out last night that I have a sister. A half-sister." He looked up at Sophie then, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "She's younger than me, and I didn't even know about her until now." Dad, he kept her a secret. The words hit Sophie like a blow. A hidden child? How could Elliot have kept something like that from his own son? She had always known there was something about Elliot that she couldn't fully understand. But this? This was beyond anything she had ever imagined. "He didn't even tell me about her, Miss Adams," Lucas went on, his voice raw with hurt. "And now I'm supposed to just accept it. Accept that he's been living this whole other life, this whole other family without me, without us." Sophie felt the heaviness of Lucas' words settle deep within her. She had always been the one to protect him, to offer him comfort. But now she felt helpless. She had known about the distance between Lucas and his father, but this was a new level of betrayal. "Lucas," Sophie began, but she didn't know what to say. How could she offer comfort when she was feeling just as betrayed? "I asked him about it," Lucas said, his fists clenched in frustration. "I asked him why he didn't tell me about my sister, and he said he was trying to protect me. Protect me from the truth. But all I feel is anger. I don't understand how he could keep something like that from me." Sophie reached out to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She had no words that could ease the pain he was feeling, but she knew one thing. This was more than just about Elliot's past. It was about the lies, the secrets, and the sacrifices that had led to this point. Elliot had built an empire, but it had come at a steep price. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Lucas and what he had revealed. She knew she had to speak to Elliot again. They needed to talk about this. But as the days passed, she began questioning everything. Had Elliot really wanted to protect his family? Or was this just another selfish choice? Another lie to cover up the cracks in the life he had built? Sophie couldn't stop thinking about her own past with him. She had trusted him, loved him with all her heart, only for him to walk away and leave her with nothing but empty promises. But this was different. He had kept a whole part of his life hidden from his son, his own flesh and blood. That evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Sophie felt a wave of confusion wash over her. What did she want? Did she want to confront Elliot? Did she want to hear his excuses? Did she even want him in her life again? She knew one thing for certain. The man she had once loved was not the man standing in front of her now. He was a stranger, wrapped in wealth and power, but with a heart full of secrets. And that was when he realized what truly mattered. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life was teetering on the edge. The revelation from Lucas about his half-sister had shaken her to her core. She had always believed in second chances, in forgiveness. But this felt like a betrayal on a scale she hadn't expected. Elliot, the man who had once meant everything to her, was now a stranger who had built a life without her, without his son, without the family he had promised. But despite everything, Sophie found herself facing the impossible, reconnecting with him. She had seen the cracks in his carefully built empire, the guilt in his eyes, the self-imposed distance from Lucas. The question gnawed at her. Could he change? Could they rebuild what had been broken all those years ago? For the first time since their last confrontation, Sophie found herself considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Not for her and Elliot. She couldn't be sure of that, but for Lucas, for their family, however fractured it might be. It started slowly. Sophie began accepting Elliot's phone calls, albeit reluctantly. The first few were stilted, awkward exchanges about school events and Lucas. Elliot tried, she could tell, to bridge the gap between them. But Sophie couldn't ignore the bitterness that still clung to her, the anger she hadn't quite been able to let go of. She listened to him talk about his success, his empire, but all she could think about was how much he had lost along the way. How much they had both lost. At first, Sophie kept her distance, only responding when necessary, her heart still a fortress built out of years of betrayal. But then, one evening, Elliot showed up at her classroom door, unannounced, unexpected. Sophie looked up, startled, as he stood there in the doorway. The man who once shared her hopes and dreams now looked like a stranger. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the small, modest classroom, as though he didn't belong in this world, the world Sophie had built for herself after everything fell apart. "I know this is the last place you want to see me," Elliot began, his voice low, his usual confidence tempered by something raw. "But I'm here to talk. Not about business, not about Lucas, just about us, about what happened." Sophie felt the tension coil in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She had spent years building walls around her heart, learning how to live without him, learning how to survive. And now he was standing here, wanting her to open that door again. The same door he had walked out of without a second thought all those years ago. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, taking a tentative step forward. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for the chance to make things right. Not for me. For Lucas. He deserves to know who I really am, and I want to be the father he needs. But I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to start." Sophie stared at him, struggling to contain the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overtake her. She wanted to yell, to demand more answers, to tell him everything she had kept buried for years. But instead, she simply nodded. Start with Lucas, she thought. That's all that matters now. "I don't know if Lucas will ever forgive you," Sophie said quietly, the words feeling heavier than she expected. "But you have to try. For him. He's been carrying so much weight, Elliot. He needs a father, not a stranger. He needs to see that you care, that you're here for him, not just when it's convenient for you." Elliot nodded, the regret in his eyes more intense than she had ever seen. "I've made so many mistakes, Sophie. I can't undo the past, but I can try to fix the present. I want to be there for him. I want to make up for the years I wasted." For the first time in a long while, Sophie saw a glimmer of the man she had loved. But it was faint, buried under layers of regret and the realities of the life he had built. Was it enough? Was this the man she could trust again? Or was it just another version of the man who had walked away all those years ago? As the days passed, Sophie watched from the sidelines as Elliot made efforts to reconnect with Lucas. It wasn't easy. Lucas was resentful, angry that his father had abandoned him for so long, and Sophie didn't blame him. Every step forward seemed to be met with resistance. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Elliot didn't give up. He showed up at Lucas' school events. He called when Lucas was struggling, and he spent quiet evenings with him, trying to rebuild the bridge that had once been burned beyond repair. Sophie couldn't help but notice the shift in Lucas. The boy who had been distant, withdrawn, now seemed to open up just a little more each day. She saw glimpses of the young man he could be, the one who still carried the spark of potential she had always known was there. And it was because of Elliot's persistence. Sophie realized, for the first time, that Elliot wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for Lucas, too. But as the weeks went on, Sophie began to question her own role in this fragile new beginning. Was she just a bystander, watching their attempts at reconciliation from afar? Or could she truly forgive Elliot for the years of hurt he had caused? She had sacrificed so much for her son, for her life. Was she willing to sacrifice the walls she had built around her heart for the sake of healing? Was it possible to allow herself to love again, to open herself up to the man who had once broken her so completely? But the hardest test was still ahead. The night of the school fundraiser was supposed to be just another event, another attempt to raise money for the school's arts program. But for Sophie, it felt like the stage had been set for something far bigger, something that had been brewing for weeks. The tension between her, Lucas, and Elliot had reached a boiling point, and the night's events would either make or break the fragile threads of their relationship. Sophie had hoped, for the sake of the school, that the evening would go smoothly. But as she looked across the crowded hall, she saw Elliot and Lucas standing near the silent auction table, an uncomfortable distance between them. They were together, but not really together. Lucas' arms were crossed, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, while Elliot kept glancing at him, trying to bridge the gap. But it was clear that the chasm between them was wide. Sophie's heart clenched as she watched them from across the room. She could see how hard Elliot was trying, but Lucas wasn't ready to forgive. He wasn't even ready to acknowledge his father's presence. As the evening wore on, the tension only deepened. The auction was coming to a close, and Sophie was about to announce the winning bids when Lucas abruptly stood up from the table, his face flushed with anger. He made his way toward the exit, clearly upset. Sophie's instincts kicked in. She knew this wasn't just about the event. Something had happened. Something had finally snapped. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lucas, wait," she called, hurrying after him. Lucas stopped just short of the door, turning to face her. His expression was a mixture of frustration, hurt, and something more. "I can't do this anymore, Miss Adams. I can't pretend everything's fine when it's not." His voice cracked, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I hate what he did to us. I hate how he just left and came back like everything's okay." Sophie stood still, unsure of what to say. The pain in Lucas' eyes was unbearable, and for a moment, she didn't know how to help him. Before she could respond, Elliot appeared behind them, his voice low and steady. "Lucas, I never meant to hurt you. I know I can't take back the years I lost, but I'm here now. I want to be here for you, if you'll let me." Lucas looked at his father, his eyes welling with tears. "Why didn't you ever come back? Why didn't you ever try?" Elliot stepped forward, his voice breaking as he reached out to his son. "I was scared, Lucas. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." There was a long silence, and then, for the first time, Lucas stepped forward, his face trembling. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to try. I want to know you, Dad." Tears welled up in Elliot's eyes as he pulled Lucas into an embrace. Sophie stood there, watching them, a lump in her throat. For the first time in years, she saw the man she had loved and the son she had fought for come together, even if it was only a small step. Sophie wiped her own tears away, realizing that, for all the pain and heartache, something had finally begun to heal. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the fundraiser felt different. Sophie watched as Elliot and Lucas began to carve a new path together, one step at a time. The change was slow, sometimes awkward, but there was a shift. Elliot was present now, showing up not just for school events but for Lucas, truly there, in ways that mattered. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and for the first time in years, Sophie saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved. One afternoon, Sophie sat across from Lucas at a cafe. He was quieter than usual, but there was a softness to his gaze that told her something had changed. "I'm trying, Miss Adams," Lucas said quietly, his voice full of honesty. "It's hard, but I think I'm ready to forgive him for me, at least." Sophie's heart swelled. "It's okay to take your time, Lucas. Healing takes time, but every step is progress. As they sipped their drinks, Sophie's phone buzzed. It was a message from Elliot. "Am taking Lucas to the park today. Thought it might be nice to spend some time together, just the three of us. Trying to make things right, Sophie." Her breath caught. She had never imagined this moment, never imagined that Elliot, so distant before, would now take such deliberate steps toward healing their family. She smiled, knowing that this was a small but significant moment for them all. Later that day, Sophie stood at the edge of the park, watching Elliot and Lucas kick a soccer ball around. The sound of their laughter was so natural, so full of life, that Sophie almost couldn't believe it was real. This was the family she had once dreamed of, but this time they were starting over. Elliot looked over at her, and their eyes met. He said quietly, "I'm glad you're here." Sophie nodded, a quiet warmth filling her chest. "Me too." As the sun began to set, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle inside her. It was perfect, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. They were moving forward, and that was enough. Love, it seemed, had a way of finding its way back, even after everything.